She was 21 years old when the bank agent nailed the notice to her family's front door and told her she had until sundown to be gone. Her name was Della Marsh, and the man who signed the papers that ruined her, a railroad land agent named Wendell Pruitt, had once shaken her father's hand at church. With $11 sewn into the hem of her only good dress, she walked 3 miles into the town of Larkspur Junction, Colorado Territory, and did the one thing everyone said only a fool would do. She bought a rusted, forgotten railroad passenger car sitting dead on an abandoned siding behind the depot, sold to her for $9 by a clerk who wanted it off the company's books. The townsfolk laughed. They said she'd bought herself a coffin with windows, but sealed beneath its rotting floorboards was something that had waited 11 years to be found. Something that would not only save Della Marsh, but hand back to an entire town what had been quietly stolen from it. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Della Marsh. If you're watching this from a town that history forgot, or a place folks still call small, tell us where you're tuning in from down in the comments. We'd love to know. And if stories like Della's mean something to you, consider following or subscribing to our channel, because we tell one of these every single week, and we'd be glad to have you back for the next one. Della had been raised on a modest wheat and dairy farm 2 miles outside Larkspur Junction, a stretch of high, dry Colorado plain where the wind never quite stopped moving and the mountains sat blue and far off on the western edge of everything. Her father, Thomas Marsh, had staked the claim in 1868, back when the land was still raw and the promise of the railroad was only a rumor traveling ahead of the surveyors. He had built the house himself, board by board, and had taught Della, from the time she was old enough to hold a hammer, that a thing was never finished being useful just because it looked finished being wanted. He fixed what other men threw away. He mended fences with salvaged wire, patched the roof with tin from a collapsed grain silo, and once spent an entire winter restoring a broken plow that a neighbor had left to rust in a ditch, only to trade it back to that same neighbor come spring for 2 milking cows. Waste is a sin against the work already done, he used to say, tapping the side of his head. Somebody already spent their sweat making this thing. Don't let their sweat go to nothing. Della's mother, Ruth, had died of a fever when Della was 9, and so it was Thomas who raised her, alone, teaching her not only how to keep accounts and mend harness leather, but how to read a room of men and know which ones were telling the truth. She grew into a young woman who was neither delicate nor hard, but steady. The kind of steady that comes from watching a parent build something out of almost nothing and understanding, in her bones, that value was not the same thing as price. She learned carpentry from her father's hands, arithmetic from his ledger books, and patience from watching him wait 3 full years for a walnut sapling to grow tall enough to shade the porch he'd built for a wife who would only sit beneath it for 6 more winters. When the railroad finally came through the territory in 1879, laying its steel across the plain not 400 yards from the marsh land, Thomas Marsh had welcomed it, believing, like most honest men, that progress and fairness traveled together. He did not yet know the agent the railroad company would send to manage its land dealings in Larkspur Junction, a soft-spoken, immaculately dressed man named Wendell Pruitt, who smiled at every social and remembered every child's name, and who would in time prove that a friendly face is sometimes the most dangerous tool a dishonest man owns. By the time Thomas Marsh died of a fall from the hayloft in the spring of 1884, Della was 19, and she had already been quietly running the farm's accounts for 2 years, because her father's hands had begun to shake and his eyes had begun to fail, though neither of them ever said the word aloud. She buried him beneath the walnut tree he'd planted for her mother, and she told herself, kneeling in the turned dirt, that she would keep the farm exactly as he'd left it. For 2 years, she nearly did. It was the water that undid her. In the end, the same water that had made the marsh land worth farming in the first place. A shallow but steady spring rose from a limestone shelf on the northeast corner of the property, feeding both the stock pond and, by an old handshake agreement, going back to the farm's earliest days, a channel that watered 3 neighboring homesteads and, eventually, the edge of town itself. In the autumn of 1886, a notice arrived by post, signed by Wendell Pruitt on behalf of the Larkspur and Western Rail Company, informing Della that a survey conducted in 1881, 5 years prior, had determined that the spring and the 18 acres surrounding it fell within a right-of-way easement the railroad had purchased from the previous landholder before her father's claim was even finalized, and that the company was, regrettably, obligated to enforce its water rights, effective immediately. Della went to the land office with her father's original claim papers in hand, certain that a mistake could be corrected with plain evidence, only to be told, gently and with practiced sympathy, that the survey in question was a matter of federal record and could not be disputed by a homestead deed alone. She hired the only lawyer within 30 miles, a tired, decent man named Otis Faraday, who worked the case for 2 months without fee before telling her, with genuine sorrow in his voice, that he could find no path around the survey, because the original 1881 documents, the ones that might have proven her father's claim predated the railroads, had, according to the county recorder, been lost in a fire that damaged the courthouse archive that same year. Without water rights, the farm could not sustain its stock or its fields, and within 6 months, the bank that held the note Thomas Marsh had taken to buy his last thresher called it due, knowing full well what the loss of water had done to the land's worth. Della sold what livestock she could, paid what she could, and still owed more than the farm itself could fetch at auction. In November of 1887, the same bank agent who had once tipped his hat to her at the county fair nailed the foreclosure notice to the door her father had built, and told her, without quite meeting her eyes, that she had until sundown. She packed what fit into a single trunk, her mother's sewing box, her father's ledger and his good folding knife, 3 dresses, and the $11 that remained of everything the Marsh family had built across 19 years, and she walked the 3 miles into Larkspur Junction, with nowhere in particular to walk to. She might have taken a room if there had been money enough for more than a week or 2 of one, and a plan for what came after. Instead, wandering the rail yard behind the depot the following morning, unable to sleep in the boarding house's thin-walled room for thinking of the walnut tree she'd left behind, she came upon a sight that had haunted the edge of her vision for years without her ever truly looking at it. An old wooden passenger car, one of the line's earliest, decommissioned nearly a decade before, and shunted onto a dead siding behind the freight sheds, where it had sat through 10 winters collecting rust on its iron fittings and moss along its north-facing boards. Its windows were fogged with grime, its once fine paint peeled to bare gray wood, and a family of barn swallows had taken up residence beneath its eaves. A yard clerk named Homer Teague, sweeping the platform nearby, told her the company had long since written the car off its books as scrap and would likely take whatever a body offered just to be rid of the eyesore. Della stood looking at it for a long while, remembering her father's voice, the sweat already spent, and something in her, some old inherited stubbornness, refused to let the number $9 feel like foolishness. She paid Homer Teague on the spot, watched him scratch a receipt onto company paper, and stood alone on the weed-choked siding as the proud owner of a rotting railroad car and nothing else in the world. The laughter started before she'd even finished sweeping out the first layer of dust. Women at the mercantile set it behind gloved hands, and men at the feed store said it to her face, calling her the railroad widow, though she'd never married a soul, and asking whether she meant to farm the tracks now that the water was gone. She let them laugh, because she had learned from her father that a thing being laughed at said nothing about its worth, only about the limits of the people laughing. She spent her first week scrubbing decades of soot from the car's tin ceiling and prying loose the water-swollen boards along its northern wall, intending to salvage what timber she could sell for a few coins toward flour and coffee. It was on the fourth day, working a crowbar beneath a floorboard near the old conductor's booth at the car's forward end, that the wood gave way not with the dry crack of rot, but with the hollow, resistant sound of something built to conceal, rather than simply age. Beneath it lay a shallow compartment, lined with tarred canvas gone brittle and dark, clearly built into the car's frame long before it had ever been abandoned, and inside that compartment, wrapped in a man's oilcloth coat and tied with waxed cord, sat a leather-bound book, its pages foxed but whole, its cover stamped in faded gilt with initials that were not her own. E.D. Della sat back on her heels in the dust-mote light slanting through the grimy windows and understood, with the particular stillness of a person standing at the edge of something larger than themselves, that whatever she had bought for $9, it had never truly been just a car. The diary belonged, its first page told her, to a woman named Eliza Doyle, who had worked for 6 years as a records clerk in the Larkspur and Western Rail Company's land office, a position she had held quietly and competently from 1879 until the autumn of 1885, when, according to the company's own personnel record, which Della would later track down at the county archive, Eliza Doyle had resigned without notice and vanished from Larkspur Junction entirely. But the diary told a different story than the company's tidy record, and Della read it over 3 sleepless nights by lamplight, her back against the cold wall of the railroad car, unable to stop even when her eyes burned. Eliza Doyle had been the clerk responsible for filing the company's original 1879 land survey, the true and honest survey, the one that showed clearly and without ambiguity that the water rights to the Marsh Spring and 11 other homestead water sources along the northeast line belonged, as they always had, to the settlers who'd claimed them years before the railroad ever arrived. It was Wendell Pruitt, newly appointed as land agent that same year, who had come to her in the spring of 1881 with a second survey already drafted, a false one, and instructed her to file it in place of the first, to backdate certain company purchase records, and to see to it that the original 1879 survey and its supporting deeds were destroyed. When Eliza refused, quietly at first and then in writing, Pruitt had threatened to accuse her of embezzling company funds, a charge he could easily fabricate given her access to the land office ledgers, unless she cooperated. Eliza had cooperated, filing the false survey as ordered. But she had not destroyed the true one. Instead, fearing exactly the kind of ruin Pruitt could visit upon anyone who crossed him, she had spent 4 careful months making a complete handwritten copy of the original 1879 survey, along with sworn statements from 2 other clerks who'd witnessed the switch, and a detailed accounting, in her own careful hand, of every homestead whose water Pruitt intended to steal, including, Della saw with a chill running down her arms, the farm of one Thomas Marsh. Eliza had hidden the diary and its copied documents in the one place she trusted no one to think to look. A decommissioned railroad car she knew was slated for the dead siding, sealing it beneath the floor with the help of her brother, a car repairman, intending to retrieve it once she'd found a lawyer or a newspaperman brave enough to help her use it. But the final entries in the diary grew shorter and more frightened, describing threats made against her family, a fire that damaged her rented rooms under circumstances the sheriff called accidental. And finally, dated the 14th of September 1885, a single line: "I am leaving tonight for my sisters in Kansas. I dare not carry the book. God forgive me for what I could not stop, and let it be found by someone braver than I was." Beneath that entry was nothing more, only blank pages, and Della understood that Eliza Doyle had run for her life and left the truth behind her, sealed in the floor of a car nobody, in 10 years, had thought to open, until a girl with $9 and nothing to lose had pried up the boards. Della did not act rashly. She had her father's patience in her, and she understood that a piece of paper, however true, meant little against a man as practiced in charm and influence as Wendell Pruitt, who had by then become not merely the rail company's land agent, but a man courted by the county's judges and merchants alike. A man who had in fact personally financed the very bank that had foreclosed on her family's farm. She spent nearly 3 weeks quietly verifying what Eliza's diary claimed, walking the county archive with Otis Faraday at her side, comparing survey markers still visible on the land itself against the false 1881 survey's numbers, and finding, exactly as Eliza had documented, discrepancies that no honest surveyor could explain away. She wrote, with Faraday's help, to Eliza Doyle's sister in Kansas, and received back a letter confirming that Eliza was alive, frightened still, but willing to swear to the truth of her diary if it meant the wrong she'd been forced into might finally be undone. It was around this same time that word reached Wendell Pruitt, through the small and porous channels of a small town, that the Marsh girl had been asking pointed questions at the county archive, and had taken to spending long hours with Otis Faraday behind closed office doors. Pruitt came to the railroad car himself one gray afternoon, dressed as impeccably as ever, and stood on the weed-grown siding with his hat in his hands, speaking to Della in the same warm, reasonable voice he'd used on her father years before, offering her, with no apparent irony, $40 for the old car to spare her further trouble living in such an unsuitable place. An offer so far beyond the car's worth that its true purpose could not have been plainer. When Della declined, politely but plainly, Pruitt's warmth cooled by degrees, and he reminded her, still smiling, that a young woman alone in a railroad camp town, without family or standing, could find life made very difficult for her, one small unpleasantness at a time, if she chose to make enemies of the men who ran things. Within a week, the general store's owner, a man beholden to Pruitt for a business loan, stopped extending her credit for flour and coal oil. The boarding house where she'd taken a single night's lodging months before suddenly had no room for her when she inquired again. 2 of the 3 farmers whose water Pruitt had stolen, men who might have stood beside her, quietly declined when she came to ask for their support, fearful of losing what little the railroad still allowed them. Even Homer Teague, the yard clerk who'd sold her the car in good faith, was called into the company office and warned, in terms he later admitted to Della had frightened him badly, that his position depended on his silence regarding the car's contents. Standing in the cold car that had become both her shelter and her burden, Della understood that she held the truth in her hands, but that the truth alone, unspoken and unsupported, could be buried again just as easily as it had been dug up, and that Wendell Pruitt was patient enough and powerful enough to wait her out until she broke. She did not break, because she thought, in the long nights that followed, of her father's hands shaking as he handed her the ledger book, trusting her to keep what he'd built even after he no longer could. And she thought of Eliza Doyle running alone into the dark, rather than let a lie stand unchallenged forever. And she decided that if the town's respectable channels had all been quietly closed to her, she would simply have to open a channel Pruitt could not close. She wrote, in her own steady hand, a full and careful account of everything the diary contained. And she made 4 copies of it by lamplight, over 2 exhausting nights, along with copies of Eliza's key entries and the sworn statement Eliza herself had at last agreed, by letter, to send from Kansas once she knew others stood ready beside her. Otis Faraday, moved by her persistence, and perhaps a little ashamed of his own earlier defeat, agreed to formally file a challenge to the 1881 survey with the Territorial Land Office in Denver, supported by Della's documentation, and he further agreed, at real risk to his standing in the county, to send a full copy to a newspaperman he trusted in Denver, a man named Aldous Pratt, who had made something of a name exposing railroad land fraud elsewhere in the territory. When Wendell Pruitt learned, some weeks later, that a Denver paper intended to run a story naming him directly, accusing the Larkspur and Western Rail Company of falsifying an 1881 survey to seize homestead water rights across 11 claims, and naming Eliza Doyle as a witness prepared to testify to the fraud under oath, the warmth he had always worn so easily finally, fully, deserted his face. He came to the railroad car a second time, no longer smiling, and threatened, this time without any pretense of reason, that he would see Della Marsh run out of the territory entirely before he'd let a story like that see print. It was Homer Teague, of all people, quiet and unassuming Homer Teague, who found his courage at last that same week, coming forward to the territorial investigator sent to examine the survey dispute and confirming, in a shaking but clear voice, that he had personally overheard Pruitt instructing a junior clerk, back in 1881, to make the new numbers match what the company wants, not what's on the ground. With Homer's testimony, Eliza's sworn statement arriving by post from Kansas, Della's careful documentation, and Aldous Pratt's story running in the Denver paper under the headline that named the fraud outright, the Territorial Land Office suspended the 1881 survey pending full investigation within the month, and the true 1879 survey, the one Eliza Doyle had risked everything to preserve, was formally reinstated as the record of standing. The restoration, when it finally came, arrived not as a single dramatic victory, but as a slow, steady return of what had always rightfully belonged to the land's true claimants. The territorial investigation confirmed every water right the false survey had stolen, restoring the spring and its channel to the Marsh Farm's boundary, and to the 11 other homesteads Pruitt had quietly starved of water over 6 years, several of which had likewise fallen into foreclosure and been absorbed. Della learned with a grim satisfaction into land the railroad company itself now held and would be compelled to return. Wendell Pruitt did not go to prison, for the fraud, though thoroughly proven, was judged a civil matter by a territorial court more interested in restoring deeds than in punishing men of his standing. But the Larkspur and Western Rail Company, eager to distance itself from the scandal splashed across the Denver papers, dismissed him from his post within the month. And no bank or business in 3 counties would extend him credit or courtesy again. He left Larkspur Junction before the first snow, and few ever learned or cared where he went. Della, offered by the territorial office the choice of reclaiming her father's original farm outright, now restored to full water rights and worth considerably more than the debt that had once buried it, made a decision that surprised the very lawyers who'd fought to win it back for her. She kept the farm, yes, restoring the walnut tree's shade to the porch her father had built, but she did not abandon the old railroad car on its dead siding. Instead, with the help of Homer Teague and 2 of the neighboring farmers whose water she'd helped reclaim, she had the car hauled onto the edge of her restored property and turned it, board by patched board, into a small schoolhouse and public reading room for the children of Larkspur Junction, the first the town had ever had, naming it, at the insistence of the whole community, the Doyle Line School. so that Eliza Doyle's name and her courage would not vanish the way she herself so nearly had. She was 19 when her father died, and left her a ledger and a lesson about the worth of things other people had given up on. She was 21 when a bank agent nailed a notice to her door and told her the world owed her nothing more than sundown to leave it behind. And she was still only 21, standing that following spring in the doorway of a schoolhouse built from a railroad car nobody had wanted, watching children file in past a small brass plaque bearing a stranger's name, when she finally understood what her father had meant all those years, sweeping wire fences and dead engines, saying that waste was a sin against the work already done. Eliza Doyle had spent 4 months of her life, and very nearly her whole future, preserving a truth she could not personally carry to safety, trusting that someday, somehow, someone braver or simply more desperate would finish what she'd started. Della Marsh had been that someone, not because she was fearless, but because she had $9, a stubborn, inherited patience, and nowhere left to run to but forward. The town that had once laughed at the railroad widow now sent its children each morning to learn their letters inside the very car they'd mocked her for buying, and the spring on the marsh land ran clear and unclaimed by anyone but the people who had always deserved it. Thank you for spending this time with Della Marsh, and with the quiet, unfinished courage of Eliza Doyle, whose voice waited 11 years under a rotting floor to finally be heard. If her story moved you, we'd be grateful if you'd share it with someone who believes, like we do, that nothing valuable is ever truly worthless, only waiting for the right person to look closer. We'd love to know, in the comments below, about a time you found real value in something everyone else had already written off. A place, an object, or maybe even a person. Until next time, stay close.